So it's not something that I don't think any of us would have thought we'd be able to say even a year ago. But there does seem to be some positive momentum in reforming the kafala system with the ultimate end of completely abolishing the system. So as you mentioned, it's a system it's a immigration system for migrant domestic workers in particular that's abusive and exploitative. And it puts the workers at the mercy of employers completely. So one of the most abusive aspects of the kafala system is that when migrant workers come to work here in the country, they sign a contract with their employer, and they can't terminate this contract without the consent of their employer.
Right.
So as you can imagine, that places them in very exploitative and forced labor situations.
Yeah.
And some of the main abuses that we've documented ranged from non-payment of wages, forced confinement in the home, to much more serious sexual, physical, verbal violence. And we did a pretty pivotal study back in 2008 where we found that migrant workers were dying at a rate of 1 per week from non-natural causes. The leading causes of death being suicide or injuries sustained from jumping off of a balcony while trying to escape the house. We tried to replicate the study in 2018, 10 years on, to see if the situation had changed, but unfortunately we weren't able to obtain the numbers that we obtained in 2008. We got the numbers from the embassies with the causes of death, and we weren't able to obtain these numbers anymore. So we couldn't do a comparison. But the situation doesn't seem to have changed, and we constantly hear horrifying reports of migrant domestic workers either sustaining very serious injuries from trying to escape the house or committing suicide.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So this is kind of, the kafala system. It's, workers can't leave their job without consent of the employer. They're not migrant domestic workers, or rather domestic workers generally, aren't covered under the labor law. So they're not granted the protections that other workers in Lebanon are granted.
Right.
And these include the minimum wage, days of rest, annual leave, paid sick leave, all of these very, very basic labor rights that every other worker in Lebanon gets, domestic workers don't get. And then on top of that, you have a justice system that's completely unresponsive to their needs and does not adequately investigate their complaints. So we did an investigation also more than 10 years ago at this point into the way that the justice system deals with complaints filed by migrant domestic workers. And overwhelmingly, we found that the justice system favors the employer.
Right.
And does not impose adequate penalties on employers for abusing their migrant domestic workers. So all of this has created a culture in Lebanon where people treat migrant domestic workers as if they were their servants, as if they were their property. And this has been very clearly reflected in the really horrifying scenes we've been seeing in front of the Ethiopian consulate, where employers who can't afford to pay their workers anymore are just dumping them in front of the consulate, as if this worker wasn't a human being. They're just, it's mind-boggling. But to me, it really is a reflection of this kafala system that has allowed Lebanese employers, to treat these workers as less than human. You have this system that allows you to get away with basically having a full-time servant in your home that's at your beck and call 24/7 that you only have to pay $150 to. So it's just a system that enables this abuse and then normalizes it. So people feel entitled to a domestic worker in Lebanon, even though really they shouldn't be able to afford to have a full-time live-in domestic worker, because it's so cheap to employ a migrant domestic worker that, most families in Lebanon have them, even if their house is not properly equipped to host an additional person.
Absolutely.
Which is why you see, migrant domestic workers being put to sleep in the kitchen or not provided with enough food. Now, the really great thing that former Labor Minister Camille Abu Sulaiman did was recognize this problem. he called it out for what it was, modern-day slavery, and he made it a priority to abolish the system. So he created a working group that's headed by the ILO and comprises several NGOs, including us, Amnesty International, Kafala Legal Agenda. And he tasked us with giving him a roadmap for how to start dismantling the system, and then start giving him recommendations on each part of the puzzle. So as a working group, we started meeting more than a year ago at this point, and we decided that, of course, I'll preface this by saying that the ultimate end goal is to abolish the kafala system and to have migrant domestic workers included in the labor law, and they should receive the same protections and rights that any other worker in Lebanon gets. And that, we made that very clear.
Yes.
But until that that needs, Parliament to ratify this amendment to the labor law. So until such time, we proposed a series of, practical measures that the Labor Ministry could take that would significantly improve the lives of migrant domestic workers and start chipping away at this kafala system.
Right.
And for us, given that migrant domestic workers aren't covered under the labor law, there's no other law that regulates their presence in the country and grants them rights and protections. The only legal document that they have is the contract that they sign with their employer. But the problem with these contracts is, they're really awful contracts that are not labor rights compliant. They don't comply with international labor standards. And the contract itself doesn't, for example, give the worker the right to terminate her contract without consent of the employer.
Right.
So, given the lack of legal protections and given that the standard unified contract was the only legal document that the worker has when she comes to Lebanon, we decided to, and it's a measure that can be adopted by the Labor Ministry. It doesn't need buy-in from anyone else. We decided to start with the contract. So the contract that we drafted and hammered out over more than a year of negotiations is one that would essentially grant migrant domestic workers the same rights that other workers get under the labor law, even though they're not covered under the labor law. So it would try to remedy this imbalance. And it would also recognize a lot of the current problems with the kafala system and seek to rectify them. So for example, one of the provisions that we included in the contract was that workers should have their own private room with adequate light and ventilation and have a door that locks, and they're the only ones that have the key. Now that's usually a level of detail that you don't include in a work contract. But we're starting from zero, under zero, 10 feet under. So we're trying to recognize what are the most serious problems in the way that migrant domestic workers are treated today, and how can we put safeguards in the contract to make sure that these actions are very clearly, not compliant with the contract, and employers could face legal penalties if they violate the terms of the contract.
But that's okay. So can I ask you though? Does this matter if a new minister comes in? So
the current labor minister has committed to moving this work forward, and we actually met with her on last Friday. And so we've been trying to hammer out the details of this contract for migrant domestic workers over the past couple of months with her team. And last Friday was one of the final sessions that we have to finalize the contract.
But do you still see this as something at this stage, the minister sees this as something that needs to be abolished, or are we not there yet? Are we just sort of?
The minister talks of reforming kafala rather than abolishing kafala.
So it's still in the reform, Right,
but we are trying to, push the conversation forward. And the contract that we saw on Friday from the Labor Ministry was one that really would have been unthinkable even a few months ago. I mean, if this contract is adopted in the form that we saw, and that's an if, it would really, start changing the culture around having migrant domestic workers in your home and start rectifying this power imbalance. But of course, enforcement is key, because you can have the best contract, and if there's no inspection and enforcement and accountability by the Labor Ministry for employers who violate the contract, then the contract doesn't matter.
I mean, the rule of law is that one issue that's always absent from any. I mean, you can talk about everything, and then when it's unenforceable, it becomes a non-issue.
Exactly. So that's why, in parallel, the ILO the International Labor Organization is working with the Labor Ministry to develop a complaints mechanism, a hotline, through which migrant domestic workers can, file complaints, and then a kind of a referral mechanism within the ministry that ensures that these complaints are being dealt with and referred to the appropriate unit to take the necessary action.
Can I ask you, in your experience, do you attribute the progress to domestic workers themselves, migrant domestic workers, sort of being more visible? And I mean that literally, on the streets, not visible from balconies or visible trying to escape. I mean visible as in protesting. Do you attribute that to this story?
I mean, I think it is a really big part. So the migrant domestic workers formed a union a few years ago. Unfortunately, the union wasn't recognized by the state because domestic workers aren't covered under the labor law.
Right.
They are not. They don't have the right to form a labor union.
Yeah,
but for us, the right to associate is key, and that applies whether or not they're covered under the labor law, under Lebanon's labor law. So the Domestic Workers Union has really been a very strong actor. They've tried to, they've engaged with us, they've engaged with civil society, they've made their demands heard, and they've been, a very important vehicle for advocating for themselves. And it's been really, truly inspiring to see the work and activism of these women who have almost zero rights, but have tried to advocate for a better future in Lebanon for themselves and for other migrant domestic workers who come to work here. So, obviously one of our main demands is that the Labor Ministry or the government recognize this union and negotiate with them. So one of the unfortunate things about this process, the Kafala abolishment process, and the working group that we're a part of, is that it lacks representation from migrant domestic workers. So in an ideal process, migrant domestic workers would have had a very prominent seat at the table.
Sure.
Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We didn't pick who was in the working group, but we did try to ensure that the voices of migrant domestic workers were heard. We insisted that the contract be put up for a national consultation that included migrant domestic workers. And that took place March 10 to 11. And it was hosted by the Labor Ministry. The ILO also had focus groups with migrant domestic workers where they gave feedback on every single article of the contract, and they made very clear what their main issues and demands are. And that, was incredibly useful for us as drafters of the contract, because we're not living their realities. So only they will be able to point out some things that are, that could have been interpreted in ways that would have harmed them, or, things that they wanted to have mentioned in the contract that we wouldn't have thought of. So their participation in the process really was key.